Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about constraints, which are a key term in Lloyd Bitzer's 1968 text, The Rhetorical Situation, and as a result are a really big term within the field of rhetoric and within this class. We'll be taking a social media approach, but that won't come till the second half of the lesson. So, in this text, The Rhetorical Situation, Bitzer claims that besides exigence and audience, every rhetorical situation contains a set of constraints made up of persons, events, objects, and relations, which are parts of the situation because they have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. So real quick, an exigence is something being responded to, right? So we see global warming occurring, and through language, we can persuade individuals to take different actions and make different decisions. That's a rhetorical exigence because it can be changed through language. If it's raining outside, there's not really any language that we could employ to change the rain. So individuals speak on certain things because they can change those things. They speak to an audience, and they try to persuade that audience, through discourse, right? Constraints come in because they, like he says here, they have this power to sort of constrain or limit or confine what we're focusing on, why we're focusing on it, how we're focusing on it. So the first way we need to understand constraints are essentially these tools that the individual rhetor can place on the situation. He or she might say something like, as American veterans, when speaking to a group of American veterans, and that constrains the focus onto a certain identity and certain values with that identity. So the role of constraints is overwhelming. Bitzer notes that of the three constituents of the rhetorical situation, the exigence, the audience, and the rhetor, constraints happens on both the audience level and the rhetor level, right? So we remember that the exigence is something we're responding to. The audience can be constrained in a variety of ways, like we said before, the American veteran example. But then also there's this other idea now that we have introduced, the constraints which influence the rhetor, right? So now constraints also operate at the individual level in which that individual rhetor speaking is limited in ways, right, because of these constraints. You might be getting angry with me now because you feel as though you still don't know where constraints are and how to look for them, right? Well, Bitzer gives us a lot of different sources for constraints. He notes documents, beliefs, traditions, facts, images, attitudes, interests, motives, right? These are all a lot of different constraints that exist both within the individual and the audience. And importantly, we need to remember that these constraints also exist within the context of the situation, which means that, say, on Twitter, for example, that specific medium might have certain traditions. There might be certain attitudes that are voiced in that space. People may respond to certain exigencies, right, and have certain motives when they engage on that space. Certain spaces have certain types of beliefs, right? A liberal newspaper is going to be steeped in liberal beliefs, right? That might constrain their overall argument. So as rhetors, as audiences, and within situations, we have constraints occurring all over the place. And what's more is you have these constraints engaging and affecting each other. So beliefs are affected by the images that one sees, right, when they're reading an argument, right, or speaking or listening. Facts also come, right? Facts are actually different to different individuals, and we all hold different facts in our mind that sort of influence what we see and believe and choose to believe. Motives affect attitudes, which affect traditions. And this happens within a larger relationship, maybe between the three, right? We could also envision an even larger circle encompassing all of this. And then documents and interests can even constrain each other, right? Because as we've seen on social media, what we are interested in constrains what types of documents we allow into our news feeds. So Bitzer claims there's two classes of constraints, those which originate in the individual writing and their method, and those that exist within the situation. But I'd ask you to think about if we can separate these two levels of constraint, right? So when an individual goes on Twitter and uses their Twitter writing process as a method, right? Then they are automatically constrained by something that exists within the situation, not within themselves, right? So we might challenge this idea that we could separate them. And when I looked online to find different examples of models that could show you where constraints lie, interestingly and perhaps tellingly, I found that constraints aren't identified, right? So here we have the owl's rhetorical situation. Where is constraints? We have another example here, courtesy of Anne Stone. Where are constraints here? Here's a really great model of the rhetorical situation that's really nuanced, and yet we're still missing constraints, right? And I think the answer lies in the fact that constraints sort of exist at all of these different levels, right? The subject, the audience, the writer, those are all constrained by a variety of things, including, as we see in this example, the exigence, the genre they're writing in, and their purpose for writing, right? All of these things can be constrained. The way I would honestly make the model is to say that as one individual tries to speak to another individual, there are a variety of constraints operating here, and as the individual attempts to talk to an increasingly high number of individuals, it becomes increasingly more difficult to employ constraints to sort of guide all of these people, right, to direct them in one certain way. But it also gets harder to simply communicate or persuade in any way because of all the constraints that all these different individuals have within themselves. So Bitzer says that from day to day and year to year, these comparable situations occur, prompting comparable responses. And as such, rhetorical forms are born and a special vocabulary, grammar, and style is established. The situation recurs, and because we experience situations and the rhetorical responses to them, a form of discourse is not only established, but comes to have a power of its own. The tradition itself tends to function as a constraint upon any new response in the form. This is as close as we get to sort of seeing how social media as platforms may sort of invite certain situations or certain types of responses to certain situations. And as individuals continue to participate on these spaces, certain traditions emerge, right? So as individuals respond using different platforms, how do the constraints of the technology aid in establishing the genres, the writing process, etc.? So for your assignment, I want you to choose a social networking site, and I want you to locate what the certain types of vocabulary, grammar, and style you see occurring. You may choose one individual profile, but if you do so, make sure it's public, or you may look across multiple profiles. Again, only look at public profiles. As you look into these spaces and pay attention to vocab, grammar, and style, also pay attention to the types of situations that you see emerging on these spaces, right? They may be situations occurring digitally, like, for example, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, or they may just be responses to real-world situations, right? So on Twitter, there was a lot of conversation the night of the Black Panther film coming out, right? So this would be a situation that occurs offline that people respond to online. Then I want you to make an argument for the types of discourse you see being established on a social networking site. You want to do this, you're free to take as much time and room as you need here, but ultimately it's really about taking 1 and 2 and then getting quickly to 3, because this is what's really the focus here, and that's identifying the constraints that you see playing the biggest part on this social networking site, given the examples you look at. And I want you to think about if it's a result of the constraints that the technology places on the writers, or if it's a relationship between the constraints of the technology, the constraints of the individual, the constraints of audiences that the individual is considering, etc. And then think about Bitzer's sources for constraints and how do they play a role in the individual, the platform being used, and the audiences that the individual is seeking, right? So how do beliefs, images, facts, documents, interests, traditions, motives, attitudes really play a role here? And if you focus a bulk of your attention to the technology, you wouldn't be doing yourself a disservice, because I really do think there's something to be said and something to discover in terms of what these spaces constrain us to be able to do, to be able to say, right? And then lastly, I want you to think about and write about how does this rhetor work within this discourse. So do you think that the rhetor goes to Twitter and tweets on this space because this type of discourse is welcomed? Are they working within it? Are they working against it, right? Are they anticipating it? Are they unaware of it? I know, for example, my mother, when she posts on Facebook, I don't think she's necessarily thinking about the discourses that go on in that space, as evidenced by the sort of approaches she takes. So yeah, if you have any questions about this assignment and what you need to do, feel free to email me, Google text me, or WhatsApp me. And yeah, good luck and Godspeed.